Welcome, everybody, to the webinar, Second That Emotion, Building Emotional Resilience. I am Jennifer Jordan. I'm a professor of leadership and organizational behavior at IMD. Absolutely delighted to be here with you on this beautiful sunny morning in Switzerland. And especially delighted because I can be here with my colleague, Silke Mischke. And Silke and I have worked together many times on various projects. And whenever I need an expert on emotional intelligence or I have a question on emotional intelligence, Silke is the person that I reach out to. Silke has her doctorate in, I want to say organizational behavior, but I might be wrong there. So Silke, you can introduce yourself with your specific title of your doctorate, but her dissertation was on the topic of emotional intelligence and trust building in executive coaching relationships. So she is truly an expert on this and recognized as a doctor on the topic, no less. So I think you're in for a real treat this morning. Silke is going to be running the show, but I will step in from time to time where I believe I can add some minor value relative to Silke's major value. So it's your show, Silke. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jennifer, for this wonderful introduction. And I'm also looking forward to be here with you this morning and to share some of our findings and thoughts about how emotional intelligence or resilience can help you cope with kind of an exceptional situation like the one that most of us experience right now. And what led us to organize specifically this webinar was in the weeks sort of beginning of the crisis, many of you reached out to us and asked, what does that mean for me as a leader? What does it mean for my team? Do we have to learn new skills? And sort of listening to your stories, we discovered that one of the common denominator which make this situation kind of challenging for many of you is that these situations, these experiences you have are emotionally very loaded. So we thought, okay, now having discovered that, how can emotional intelligence potentially help you in coping with a situation like this one? So in the webinar today, we will give you a few strategies that we think will help you cope with this kind of a situation, but also share what some of our executives have shared with us in terms of the strategies they are using to address this kind of a situation. And at the end of the webinar, you will have time to ask questions, and we are happy to answer the questions that you have at the end of the webinar. Now, just as a short introduction, here is a graph that shows on the X dimension, how pleasant do you feel from -5 to +5, and how much energy do you feel going from -5 to +5. So right now, I'm, in terms of pleasant, I'm a 4, like seeing that many of you actually joined the webinar and that there is such a huge interest for the topic. And the energy is also somewhere between 4 and 5, because I think seeing so many people coming together from all over the world, yes, gives me even more energy than I already had this morning, because Jennifer said it's a beautiful day. So that also helps, having the sunshine out there. So I'm currently a +4, +4. Now, I would encourage you to write in the chat, where do you position yourself right now? And don't judge it. It's just a perception. Okay. I see that some of you are already typing where you position yourself. And if you also look not only at what you posted, but just also look at what other people posted there, you see there's a variety of feelings right now in this very moment. We are not in the same room, but all these emotions are present. And it is important to notice and to acknowledge that an emotion is always there. So there is not such a thing, I don't feel anything, as like neither pleasant, unpleasant. I mean, sort of a neutral feeling. No, it might be more or less intense, but an emotion is always there. And that's why I really want you to encourage you to be noticing these things. So maybe that little graph that you just completed for yourself, maybe ask yourself from time to time, where is it that I position myself right now? what does it mean for the situation? So presumably, if this morning I would have been a -5 and low energy, would that have been the right state to do the webinar this morning? So, well, one option is to say, well, let's do it another time, which obviously is not an option. But the other option in such a case is, which was not the case, but if it would be the case, to say, well, I have a webinar and all these people come excited about the topic. So how can I put myself into a different mindset? So this is what it's all about, is noticing first and then see how appropriate is what you currently feel for the situation. So if right now you are in the webinar and you would be all over the place, like full of energy and full pleasant, it might be difficult to pay attention. And again, it's not about judging. It's just about raising the awareness that emotions are useful data with which you can work and that will make you more efficient in your leadership. So just a very quick introduction of what are emotions and why is it that we actually should pay attention to them. So from a pure theoretical perspective, emotions, they occur because there's a change in the environment. So the current COVID crisis is a change in the environment, and your emotions will tell you something about, what does it mean to me? What does it mean to my family, to my team? And ultimately provide you with data that you can work with in order to be able to cope more effectively with that situation. It is something that occurs automatically. It's not like you sit down at the end of the day and say, okay, this is what I read in the news. These are all the statistics I know about the COVID crisis. Okay, so I think that's what I should feel given the data. So this is an automatic reaction. Now, it's a very powerful reaction because your emotional brain has a capacity that's about 10 times higher than your frontal cortex. So this emotion is condensing many, many informations in just one feeling. Now, the more effectively you work with that feeling, the more effective you will be in your leadership. Now, as soon as I do have an emotion, it impacts what I pay attention to. If I feel negative, I might actually only look at the negative things. If I feel positive, everything looks bright and beautiful. And then that feeling I have also has an impact on how I behave. What is it that I will do depending on how I feel? And yes, they help me to adapt to the environment. So these emotions, they have a function. So I better don't ignore them. And specifically in the executive world, we get quite often the comment, you know what, at work, I'm going to park my emotions at the door. Well, just good news, this is not possible. As I said earlier, emotions are there all the time. So what will make you more effective is knowing how to work with these emotions and how to address them in a meaningful way. So that led us to do a study in which we try to understand what are those emotions executives go through during the crisis, but also how did they feel before and how do they feel now? Because now that the news are out, that we sort of see what's happening in different countries, we have some data that might have an impact on how these emotions evolve over time. And one of the questions we asked was, can you share with us what are the emotions that you experience during the crisis, like in the midst when it was at the peak for you? And here you see in that tag cloud the different feelings that people shared with us. And the size of the word in this tag cloud actually shows how often that emotion has been mentioned among those 220 executives. So as you can see, like right in the middle, one of the very predominant feelings many people went through is fear. It is anxiety, it was uncertainty, it was worry, it was stress, it was loneliness. But you also see that somewhere in between, not that big, but you also see some other feelings such as happiness, belonging, willingness, patience. So there are a multitude of feelings people experienced or still experience through that crisis that all contain a lot of data. And fear is a specifically powerful one. So I think Jennifer would like to share a bit more about the feeling of fear.
Thank you, Silke. And I love the exercise you started with. So maybe just go back in verbally. You don't have to go back to the slide with the grid. Is that I thought to myself, I talked to about a week ago, and many of you might have joined about leading virtual teams. And I think that exercise is such a great one to do perhaps with a team virtually to get that sharing of emotions at the beginning of a meeting. And you're the expert on trust building through emotions, Silke. But I can also imagine as a leader, if you start out by saying, you know what, I'm kind of low energy today and a little bit negative. I'm a -3. That can certainly help to develop virtually some trust with your team. So I think that can be really, really useful. So maybe you guys on the other line can adopt that in your team processes. But in terms of fear, I do a considerable amount of work on leading in the digital age. And I talk about oftentimes fear being one of the most important emotions, and for both negative and positive reasons. Fear is a very old emotion, so it has a strong evolutionary purpose for humans, right? So if we saw something chasing us, a big woolly mammoth, thousands of years ago, and we would all of a sudden feel fear, and that fear would get us moving, right? It gets our adrenaline going, it gets the stress hormones, the cortisol is going through our veins, and we're going to move. So fear is a very action-oriented movement, and it gets us going. But we also know from the research on fear that because that cortisol and adrenaline is released into the system, if as a leader or if as an individual, we are feeling fear all the time, it actually will over time destroy the adrenal system and later on the immune system. So you see leaders, for example, that are constantly motivating with fear. They have higher absentee levels in their teams, team members that are more likely to have burnout, et cetera. So fear can have a very positive, it gets us moving. We need it. And I see this in the digital age. Leaders that have no fear about digital disruption, they're actually not as motivated. Leaders who feel a little bit of threat, they're going to be motivated to change. So fear is a very positive and a negative purpose. Silke, I should also maybe mention that question and answer, type them in the question and answer box, and then later on, we're going to address your questions at the very end. So we're going to be very willing to address as many questions as we can. We don't know how much time we're going to have, but type them in the question and answer window, and we're going to keep track of those. So I'll mute myself now.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. And one of the, I'm just trying to get to the next slide. So one of the questions we have for you, and this is an anonymous poll that I will be launching, is which of these emotions did you either experience during the crisis or you still might be experiencing now? And I will launch the poll so you can vote for several options. Yeah, so what you can see here, that anxiety is also one of those strong feelings that many of you experienced, and so are fear and worry and frustration, loneliness. So all these feelings are actually quite present for many of you. But then you also see that a feeling like compassion, because maybe the fact of being in this crisis together is a feeling that you have shared with other people, and that probably brought you closer to these people. So any crisis has obviously some of those, I stay away from saying negative feelings, because as such, I don't think they are negative or positive feelings. They are feelings, they are emotions, they are there, and they tell us something about it. And what will make the difference for you and your leadership is like, what is it that you do about these feelings? Do you get stuck in them? Or is it something that you say, oh, that actually provides me with some very useful insights, and I'm going to work with these insights to actually address the situation even more effectively, because there's not such a situation that only has rational data. Any situation has emotions and is more or less emotionally loaded. Now, I think many of you agree that the current crisis is highly emotionally loaded. So this is not something you should be ignoring. It means to be effective is to address both what are the facts, of course, but also to what extent do the emotions provide me with additional data? Or sometimes they actually hinder me to look at the facts because I might be too much caught by that feeling, which I am not addressing. So this is a thought I think all of you might have to sort of go through and see, well, how is it that I go about these feelings? Do I address them? Do I work with them? What kind of insights do I gain listening to these emotions? And we actually have had the opportunity to talk to some of the executives from whom we received that data. And one of the other questions we asked them is how their sense of feeling safe and secure evolved over time, having experienced these feelings. And what you see in that graphic is that the majority of executives at the beginning or before the crisis felt very secure or secure. Now, in the midst of the crisis, where all these feelings that we just discussed, like fear, anxiety, anger, frustration, stress, were really, really strong, there was a total shift, more or less, to the right side of the scale. Some people even feeling very insecure, but for many people, they felt unsecure. Now, we asked that same question right now. How is it right now that actually a lot of things have happened? And you have seen how some measurements have been taken, how some governments reacted, and some sort of a new structure is put in place. And what you can see is people actually slowly move back towards feeling secure. It's not the same than before the crisis, but that also indicates that some kind of a resilience helped people to sort of address that situation. And so that made us curious. And we asked some of those people who actually felt, again, more or less secure at the very moment in time. So this was about 2 weeks ago. And one of the interesting conversations we had was around the way you look at the situation actually impacts how you deal with it. So, and that is the whole theory around thinking traps from David Burns, which is about how our sort of cognitive distortions help or sort of hinder us looking at the situation in the most effective way. So the way we look at the situation automatically impacts the way we act upon that situation. And there are mainly, there's a longer list normally, there are about 12 thinking traps, but there were about 6 thinking traps that specifically in the current situation are common to have. So we all have them. I also do have thinking traps. It's not because I know about them that I never have thinking traps, but it's helpful in such a situation to ask yourself, is it that what I'm doing? And if it's what I'm doing, what can I do about it? So one of those thinking traps is called overgeneralization. What does that mean? It's to look at an event, a negative event, and immediately think, okay, this is a series of bad events. And this is never going to stop. It's just going to happen and happen over again. There will be a second, third, and fourth, and fifth, and sixth wave, and we just sort of will have to deal with that virus for the next 25 years. So that is like taking one event and sort of see how it becomes actually a series of the same event over and over again. Then you have emotional reasoning, is taking your emotional experience as the evidence for truth. So I feel desperate, so the situation is desperate. So that is a shortcut you might be making. That's how I feel, and that's how the situation is. Filtering is I only look at the negative effects of the current crisis. And actually, there are a lot of also opportunities out there. It's like there might be new, more sustainable business being created because we actually do realize maybe some of that extensive traveling is not necessary. So maybe that is a real opportunity for many organizations, or rethinking our business, or we talk all about digitalization, but do we really do it? Now, we have actually some data over the past few months, how well certain things actually work in a digital world. Then you have black and white thinking. It's similar to filtering, but it's more like looking at the situation as a whole. A situation is either bad or good. It's either a success or failure that prevents you from sort of seeing the data in terms of what else is out there. So a situation is not neither bad or good or success or failure. There are always aspects you have to use in order to think about what is the positive. Catastrophizing is to actually think about the worst. My company is going to go bankrupt. Other businesses are going to go bankrupt. The whole economy will be going down the drain, and we are not going to recover from this within the next 15 years. So that might be catastrophizing. And personalization is to look at the problem in terms of it's all my fault. So, for example, in my role as the CFO, if I would have built stronger reserves, we would not have to lay off all these people. It's all my fault. So this is personalization. And you will see, I mean, maybe while you were listening, that some of these things, we sometimes do it to ourselves. And it's normal. It's a way of looking at the situation. What will make a difference is to be able to move out of such a thinking trap. Now, just before we sort of comment on that, we also have prepared a poll on the thinking traps. And we also want to know from you which of these thinking traps you might have experienced. And we see, I mean, there is not like a huge gap among the different thinking traps, but we can see that emotional reasoning is one of those thinking traps that actually has got sort of the strongest response from you. Is like, because I feel desperate, the situation is desperate. And again, that might be a first reaction many of us have. And then what will make the difference is this idea, and some of you might have heard about it, is the idea of being mindful. There is a difference in saying, I'm desperate, or I notice I'm desperate. So I would encourage you, as of now, if you don't do it already, to sort of start noticing these feelings. It's like, okay, I notice I feel desperate, but why is it that I'm desperate? And that actually opens the opportunity for you to really work with some of these thinking traps. Right, Jennifer?
Yes, I'm going to unmute myself. Thank you, Silke. So I told Silke I wanted to comment on this slide after the poll, because I think first is the state of self-awareness that you just talked about as the mindfulness, right? How do you know you're in these thinking traps and catching yourself when you're in them? I think that's the first step, but then knowing what to do with it when you're in it. And for me, I was about almost 20 years ago now, I was someone who was very much, I would say, in the catastrophizing thinking trap. So I would think about something negative that would happen, and I would think, oh, it's the end, it's over. And one of my, the most meaningful things I've ever done in my life is to read a book called The Power of Now. Silke, do you know it? With Eckhart Tolle.
Yeah.
And the whole idea is that, if you live in the now, if you're truly in the moment, you're not going to feel anxiety. You're not going to feel that stress of the future, because at the moment you're probably okay, right? So if we think about, where most of us are, I'm going to hope that most of us in the call are healthy. We're in a safe place. We have food to eat. Things are okay now. And it's our projection of the future, which oftentimes is not correct. We make it up in our mind. That brings us the anxiety. So we can be mindful of where we are at the present moment and be aware of those kind of mental fantasies that we project. We will find happiness and we will find peace. And that also started me on a meditation practice around being in the now. So I would say, the first step is as Silke beautifully explained, these 6 different thinking traps, being just aware of what they are and being aware of them, but then saying, okay, what do we do with that mentally, and trying to get into that space of mindfulness and to be present. Thank you, Silke.
Okay, well, thank you, Jennifer, for commenting. This is really helpful. And now on the next slide, so I will just close the poll as well. We are going back here. On the next slide, I will share with you how your emotional abilities, because we promised you some strategies on how to actually work with these emotions effectively. And we will share with you how the emotional abilities will help you as one of the strategies. There are many strategies. One is to obviously, once you have identified a thinking trap, to sort of reprogram your brain and look at that perspective and taking consciously a different view. So get out of the view you might have, which is the trap, and sort of think about it in a different way. If it's personalization, well, okay, there is maybe one part I took into this whole situation, but what are the other elements that actually led to results? So that might be a way to get out of personalization. It's just try to think at the same situation coming from a different angle. And in terms of the emotional skills, there are 4 key abilities when it comes to emotional intelligence and emotional abilities that also might help you. And we just do it maybe with the example of experiencing fear. So the first step is, and that's an emotional ability, is to perceive. What is it that I do have as an emotion? Well, actually, I do experience fear. So that's a very accurate identification and nomination of my feeling. The next step then is to say, here it says use emotions to facilitate your thought. So the question here is, how does that emotion that I experience right now impact my thinking? So as I said earlier, and I will repeat it many times, is never judge an emotion. It is there. And the first step is to notice it and then start working with it. So now this using part is, okay, how helpful is that amount of fear that I currently experience to give hope to my team? How helpful is it to create a new perspective for my organization? How helpful is that fear to reassure my family? I mean, it might be multiple reasons, but the next step is to say, okay, helpful, not so helpful. Then the next dimension is understanding. Okay, why is it that I do experience that amount of fear? Well, it might be multiple reasons. It might be because actually I'm fearing for my job. It might be that I'm fearing that I will lose the respect from my family. It might be that I'm fearing for my team because I know their stories and I know that it will impact them a lot because they might be losing their jobs and it might impact their financial situation in a way that I wouldn't feel very happy about. So try to collect as much data as possible. And once you have that data, the last and most important step then is to manage. So how can I work with that emotion? So if I'm fearful that my family won't respect me anymore because I will be losing my job, well, the first thing you would probably be doing is actually talk to them and have a conversation rather than keeping that fear inside that's blocking you. If it's about the fear to lose your job, okay, then have a very sort of rational approach in a way with that emotion and say, how likely is it that I'm losing my job? If it's very likely, which is one option, what are my options? So you never should get stuck in any of these feelings, but rather use them as a very, very strong driver in order to better understand that information. Because as I said, they are informations, all these emotions that you experience, and the way you work with them will make the difference. And you see also here, there is a categorization in experiential emotional skills and strategic skills. So experiential is everything that you experience, as says the word, and that's the data. So the more accurate you are about that data, the more effective you can be in bringing in some of these strategies, like the emotions you manage. And managing can also mean manage emotions of other people. I mean, you as a team leader, you might be confronted to multiple emotions these days because it's not only your own fear, but it's actually also the fear that sits with the team. So you might actually be taking on some of that anxiety on your side. And again, the best way to work with it and find a new perspective and move out of that sort of limiting experience is to address it. And for that, you have to see what's the data, what does it mean, and how can I effectively work with that data. And based on that model, we thought we will actually share a short story with you that is coming from one of our participants, whom we call here Kim Taylor. So it is not Kim Taylor. And also to make sure that the story is totally anonymous, we also changed the business and the country. So don't try to guess who Kim Taylor is in real life. So this is a story of a VP of a global medical device company based in Germany. And this company, they started seeing the first effects already end of January, because they were heavily dependent on supply coming from Asia. And some of the components they needed to produce their devices was actually not delivered anymore due to the travel restrictions. And it just got worse and worse and worse over the weeks following, because they had to shut down some of their business units because they couldn't work because they didn't have the critical components. And then end of April, mid of April, they actually started losing some of their real important customers. And then it became very clear end of the month of April that they will have to lay off 80% of their workforce to actually make it through the year. What do you think, I mean, listening to that story, what do you think are some of these feelings that Kim Taylor experienced sort of through that whole crisis? And you can write them in the chat and share with us what are some of these feelings that you think that Kim Taylor experienced. Okay, well, thank you. I see that some of you are still typing. And yes, you're absolutely right. It might have been worry, frustration, stress. So all of these are feelings that Kim most likely experienced in that situation. And they are normal feelings. I mean, none of you would possibly say, well, these feelings are totally inappropriate. There is no reason why he should have felt that. No. So as we sort of saw at the beginning of this webinar, emotions help us adapt to the situation. So everything that Kim experienced was actually data that he was able to use in an effective way to address the situation. There's stuff that he cannot change. I mean, he can't change the global picture, but what he can change is the kind of conversations he had with his team, the kind of vulnerability he also showed to his team, and actually talked about how he is experiencing that situation, and still providing them some kind of a safe framework, knowing that there is stuff that is out of his control. So this is a vulnerability that he actually did share with his team in that situation. And he doesn't have a kind of crystal ball to tell them exactly what's going to happen over the next 8 months. So having talked to some of Kim's team members, despite the fact that the situation is very challenging and obviously not a 100% positive outlook, but it also says, well, actually 82%, sorry, will still have a job at the end of the year. So it's always a way how you look at the situation. And having talked to some of Kim's team members, they still felt actually quite helped by Kim throughout the whole crisis. So there is something about working with these emotions, addressing them if necessary with your team, that will make the difference. And sort of building on his example, Jennifer and I came up with a model which we call the 4 L's of emotional resilience. And the first L is listen. Listen to that emotion that you experience. So first of all, acknowledge, I do have an emotion. This is not a situation where I can just go about a fact. There is an emotion or various emotions that are present. The next step is label. What are these emotions? And the very first step is, if you think about that graph we shared with you at the beginning of the webinar, is to be able to say positive, negative. How intense is it? Very strong, it's a little strong or not strong, whatever it might be. And then even be more precise. What is that feeling about? And it doesn't have to be just one feeling. It's rare that people feel only one emotion. So maybe, at the current stage, there is still some fear, there's maybe still some anxiety, but maybe there's also some excitement about what will this change bring to our business? What will this change bring to my team? So there might be a different emotion already taking more space right now, but try to be as precise as possible and label that emotion. The next dimension is learn. What can I learn by exploring that emotion? Why is it that I'm experiencing all of these feelings? Why is it that I'm fearful? Or in the case of Kim, he did experience worry. He did experience anxiety. So what is it that he can? Well, he actually learned from it that one of his biggest concerns was not so much about himself. It was actually about his team, because he was very senior in the company, and actually he's quite close to his retirement. So he didn't have any existential fears for himself anymore. So what he learned by listening and labeling these emotions was, well, I do care about my team. So then we go to the next step, the leverage. So how can he leverage that? Well, actually what Kim did is he talked to his team. And he was not using it as an excuse. You know what? There's not much I can do. We just have to sort of lay off 18% at the end of the year. That's not what he did. He actually created some space for the team first and said, how do you feel? What are some of your anxieties? And if people said, well, actually, I'm fearful of losing my job. And then Kim said, well, I do understand that fear. And you know what? At this stage, I can't yet tell you how many people will be keeping their jobs. I will do everything that's under my power to make sure that as many of us can stay by the end of this year. But this is different than just sitting with that fear. Oh my gosh, I hope we don't have to lay off these people. And then, in November, you actually write all these letters. That is very different. So he was really leveraging that fear he experienced in that very situation. Would you like to comment on that, Jennifer?
Sure, I would love to. And there's a reason why Silke's name comes first in this model. This was truly her brainchild. So she just put me on there to be nice. But I've thought a lot about these 4 levels since Silke shared them with me. And I think to me, they whittle down to one thing is becoming comfortable talking about emotions in the workplace as a leader. And it's not only for you to listen, label, learn, and leverage, but can you help your team as leaders to do this? And can you be an emotional role model? Which for me was such, when I was introduced by Silke and other colleagues that are experts in this area, introduced to this idea, this was so foreign for me because I definitely grew up in a household and a mindset where being strong, being a leader meant putting your emotions to the side and not being emotional. And I've learned from my colleagues who are experts in this, the absolute importance of emotions in the workplace, but also as a leader, you being a role model to say, being a leader doesn't mean putting the emotions to the side, but really listening, labeling, learning from them, and leveraging and using emotions in the way you speak. So, doing something like that grid exercise that Silke mentioned of starting a meeting by saying, where are you? And talking about if I'm high energy, highly negative, what is that? Is that anger? Is that aggression? So starting to actually put labels onto these emotions as a leader and helping other people to be more in touch with their emotions can be a very helpful and very cathartic exercise for building trust amongst teams virtually or face-to-face.
Yeah, absolutely. And to sort of give you a little bit of an illustration, what sort of real listening means and real labeling, it also requests you to show empathy. And sometimes we think of empathy only in terms of, empathy towards others. But actually, empathy is also about how empathetic am I towards myself. So what I said, and I say it again, don't judge your emotion, but connect with it. And to give you a little illustration of what's the difference between empathy and sympathy, we have prepared to share a little video with you. So bear with me a second to just put it up there.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here. And you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay, so I'm going back to our presentation. So as you saw in that little video, true empathy is about experiencing that emotion and using that experience to learn from that experience and be able to leverage. So it's really linked to that emotional experience. So that shows you even more how important it is to not judge an emotion, because it provides you with some really, really useful insights. And just before we go to sort of listening and getting your questions, we also have prepared a few very concrete tips you might want to use when it comes to creating that emotional space and working more effectively, not only as an individual, but also with your teams on emotions. So one of the real important tips is that now that many of you actually do have virtual meetings, Skype, Zoom, WebEx, whatever technology you might be using, actually create that space and ask how people feel, or do the first step and say how you feel about the current day, the current meeting, because I think there's a huge risk, and maybe some of you have experienced that, especially in the beginning, having multiple virtual meetings, people somehow got very task focused. You know, if normally you go in a meeting room, you might sense the room, you might sense the kind of feelings that are there, and you might address it, maybe not explicitly, but somehow in the way you talk to each other, you might actually address these feelings when you share a physical space. Now, in virtual space, you will have to create that space, because we are not yet used to actually read the virtual context the same way we are used to read the face-to-face context. So this is something we have to learn, and one step towards that direction is actually asking how people feel. Then also I think for any team, this is an opportunity to maybe revisit some of these ground rules. If you have set ground rules in the past, basically these are rules of interactions. How do we want to challenge each other? How would we like to interact? How do we make sure that everyone participates? So these are rules that you may want to revisit or define for the first time if you haven't put these rules in place, because it helps. It helps getting people responsible in these meetings. Do you want camera or not? Well, actually, there might be some people who stay away from using the camera, but yet, you know what? It actually does create a sense we are all sitting in the same room. So if there's one or two members of the team who don't like it, have a conversation around it. I mean, what is the added value rather than what is it that I want to protect about me not sort of showing my face on the camera? Then also think about some social times in these meetings. It's like there can be the first 10 minutes in a meeting, if it's a weekly meeting, where people come with their tea or their coffee and they share about something that's going on in their personal life, to also have the function that normally a physical space would have, to sort of discharge some of these emotions the team is sitting with. Then also, very important to have breaks between the meetings. So don't just schedule your whole day from one task to the next, and somehow have these emotions piling up within you. And then you sit there at the end of the day and all these emotions are somehow sitting with you. And you feel exhausted. You might feel exhausted because actually that energy that you use to not deal with these emotions is still energy, and you might feel double tired at the end of the day of not having addressed them. And then also, because many of us actually do have to work from home. So today I have the privilege to work from IMD again, which is nice. But most of the time I'm actually also working from home. That means that you have to create those sort of spaces, and it might be simple things, you know. It's like, even if you work from home, you may want to dress up the same way than if you go to office, because then guess what, if in the evening you sort of change the way you would do coming home, that again sort of creates that space between 7:30 and 6 in the evening. This was work, now I'm at home again. Or also make those clear breaks that are breaks in terms of maybe the lunch break, but then there is work mode again, because I think for your brain, it's really important to have those sacred spaces where you also can get energy back. And then, define what these new routines are. And then Jennifer mentioned that earlier as well. Keep an emotional diary. So it doesn't mean that you have to write it down necessarily, but what it means is sort of listen to these emotions. Maybe, I mean, there are different ways of doing it. You could sort of say, well, I ask myself morning, lunch, and evening how I feel, or I take critical moments after a long team meeting or after a conversation with my boss, I will check. So just try to be very mindful about your emotional world. And then in the next step, use one of those strategies, hopefully, that you have seen in the webinar today about the 4 L's, about the emotional abilities, and say, okay, now what does that mean that I do have these emotions? So you can play around with any of these strategies that you have seen in the webinar today.
Such great tips, Silke. Thank you. And I'm reading this thinking to myself, okay, I'm definitely one of the shoemakers whose kids or who actually herself walks around with holes in her shoes, because I'm guilty of doing the back-to-back virtual meetings. I have so little time and I need to just get a ton of meetings all together. So I think that was a good tip for me to think about. Are we ready to move on to questions?
Yeah.
Okay, super. So Silke, we have so many great questions and only about 10 minutes to answer them. So I'm going to start with one from Thor. He asks, how can I work as a leader against fear in the organization if the fear has been imposed from outside like now? So I think he's saying, you know, if there's fear, I feel this emotion circulating my organization. It's not really from us, but, you know, there's news coming from outside, projections about our industry maybe. How do I deal with the emotions inside? What would you recommend to Thor?
Yeah, so I think like in any situation as a leader, to know what is the impact you can have as an individual, because I think there's obviously a lot in what you just shared is like me as an individual. You think this is the inner circle, then my outer circle is maybe my team. My team, the next circle, is part of an organization. And then this organization is part of a bigger cultural context, or maybe even the world economy. So now I'm this little center here. So where is it that I can have the biggest impact? And you can look at it maybe like an earthquake, right? And so you are the epicenter of the earthquake. So the biggest impact you will have to the circle that's closest to you. So that's your team. So I think the first thing you can do is to actually have a conversation about the amount of fear that is sitting within your team. And then you might want to use something that's used in stress management, is to look at the problem in terms of what is under my control. Because sometimes when people are stressed, is they feel out of control. So one way of bringing it back and be in control is to say, what are the parts of that problem I'm in control of? And then you can draw a pie chart and say, well, actually, the parts I'm in control of is what I do with my own anxiety. The parts which are about what the government is going to decide, if we are allowed to sort of travel again, if we are allowed to sort of bring in those components we need due to travel restriction, is out of my control. So if that is a very conscious thing I do, I can take a step aside and say, well, I should not worry about stuff that I cannot influence. And then it depends on your role. So if you are part of the board, well, actually, you're much closer to that outer circle, which is the whole organization. And you also have the responsibility. So if you are part of the board of an organization and you do see that actually right now, the whole organization is almost stuck in this feeling of fear and people worry too much, and you see it in all the communication, then as a board member or as the team, you have a responsibility to actually say, what can we do in order to cascade down this? How can we address and sort of live with this feeling and learn from that feeling and create an opportunity for ourselves?
Great answer. And I think that goes back to the saying about, if you can control it, don't worry. And if you can't control it, don't worry. So really being mindful and aware of what is your sphere of influence and how large does that sphere go. And also acting as a secure base for your team, I think, is also super important, and role modeling those emotions. So I think we have time for one more question, perhaps, depending on how quickly it is answered. And it's a lot of pressure for me, Silke, to choose that one question because there's so many good ones. This is from an anonymous member of the webinar, or an anonymous participant. If your personal status is not so great at the moment, so loneliness, family situation, maybe loved ones with COVID, how do you manage to separate that and power through as a manager, especially when you're at home? So how do you sort of put aside your negative personal situations, or not put it aside? How do you integrate that into your leadership?
Yeah, so I think it is actually not about putting it aside, because it is part of what you experience right now. And that's also what I said when we have all these virtual meetings and we don't create the space for people to be sad, for people to actually come in with their baggage of, well, I do have family members who are sick, and my mind is actually also with them, and I can't be 100% in the meeting. I think that is human. Now, I believe if in those meetings, for example, you do have the first 10 or 15 minutes, or maybe only 5 minutes, I mean, it depends on the size of the team, of course, to say, you know what, it's not easy for me these days to actually stay focused, because there's always part of my energy and my mind thinking about how I can best support these family members, or I'm actually even worried about how this is sort of going to evolve, because this is a serious disease. Sometimes just having the opportunity to talk about it will actually discharge some of that emotion, because it's totally normal that if you have someone to worry about, that you cannot just say, okay, I switch this off right now because now I'm in this meeting and it doesn't belong here. Would be wonderful if we could do that, but we can't. Now, what we can do is to say, it is there. I would like to share aspects of that. And that helps you then, because it discharges a little bit that very intense feeling. And that becomes maybe a little less intense for the time of that meeting. And then you can also have maybe some attention going to what actually the meeting is about. But you should not ignore it.
That's a great point, Silke. And I think, you're the expert on trust building through emotions, but we also know that being vulnerable and sharing our state with our teams help to build trust. And at least in my experience in working with teams, I think there's also a thin line that a leader has to play between unloading too much on the team and also being honest and vulnerable with the emotions, because sometimes it can be too much, right? If you share everything about your personal life, it can be distracting, but also giving people, especially if your team members are sensitive and they notice that you're in a negative space, they might be attributing it to themselves. Oh, did I do something to annoy my leader? Or did I do something this morning that they're not happy with? And just sharing, my personal life right now, it's really challenging being at home. I have a little baby, etc. Helps them to also be able to read you better as a leader, which can be very valuable in a team context. Do we have time to take one more quick one, maybe? Yeah. All right, I'll do a quick one. From Mattia, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. When I have a negative emotion, should I just wait and take my time until it goes away? What else can I do that might be more effective?
Yeah, so as I said, any emotion is helpful data. So for an emotion to go away is very unlikely, because as long as you haven't addressed it, I mean, if you are frustrated about something, then yes, obviously over time that frustration is going to fade. So for example, if it's an interaction with always the same person that gets you frustrated, for as long as you haven't addressed what actually initially triggered that frustration about that person, because this person constantly comes late to meetings. But since this is your manager, maybe you never addressed it with your manager because you feel disrespected, but you think, well, it's my manager, so I'm not going to address him being late all the time. As long as you haven't addressed it with your manager, that frustration will come back over and over again. So in the current situation, feeling negative or feeling fear, for example, well, sort of waiting for it is almost hoping that the actual general context will do it for you. Like the general context brought a problem that created fear. Now the general context is going to solve it for you. That makes you even more vulnerable, because it's not you taking the control in that situation. It's like most of us lost control when that situation occurred, and we experienced fear, worry, and stress and all of that, because it's not something that we sort of actively impacted. Now, I do have a conscious choice now and say, well, actually, what is it that I can do in that situation and feel in control and have the possibility to influence what is going to happen next? Makes you feel much more powerful than actually waiting for the fear to sort of fade away over the time.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's also, just to add to that very quickly, it's funny for me about how I separate emotional pain in terms of how I deal with it. My inclination how to deal with physical pain versus emotional pain. Emotional pain, I'll often say, I hope it goes away. But if I have a pain in my leg, I'll take a paracetamol, or I'll massage it, or I'll stretch it. And I would say apply the same thing to your emotional pain sometimes. Don't just assume it will go away, because it often gets worse, not better with time. And, think about something that makes your emotion feel better. Go for a walk or call a friend in a way that will raise your emotions, just like you might massage your sore calf. Yeah.
That's a beautiful metaphor.
All right. Thank you, guys and girls, for joining today. And hope you all took something valuable out of it. I know for me, I was kind of low energy when I started. My son woke up at 5 a.m. and didn't want to go back to sleep. But after this, it definitely was a good energy and emotion lifter for me. So thank you all for that.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.